The Imperial Harem of the Ottoman Empire. Origins of the harem. When humanity shifted from hunting and gathering to agriculture, power structures formed between those who had resources, mainly through the ownership of land, and those who did not. It was at this time when men started gaining serious control over women, cementing himself as the head of the household and her as part of his property. For some cultures, this new societal situation resulted in polygamy. More women equaled more help across a man's land, making polygamy a beneficial economic structure. In the story of Adam and Eve, women are painted as born of the flesh, as Eve was formed from Adam's rib, instead of being born from God as men were, making them seductresses and sinful. In Islam, this view of women led to a belief that they needed to be kept separate from men, as they couldn't help but seduce them. The historical precedent of polygamy, the belief that men's morals needed to be protected from women, as well as the Prophet Muhammad's sanctioning of polygamy in order to stop female infanticide, all led to the creation of harems. What is a harem? When you hear the word harem, it probably summons images of beautiful women, whose only purpose is to please the Sultan, lounging around pools. This image is largely incorrect, summoned by a Western fantasy. The word harem has multiple meanings. It comes from the Arabic word haram, which means unlawful, protected, or forbidden. A harem is the part of the household where women and children live, where men who are not relatives cannot enter. It can also be used to refer to the women themselves. My harem, for example, can mean both the physical space of the harem or the women who live inside it. A man's harem did not only include his wives. It also included his other female relatives, such as his mother, aunts, or sisters, his young children of both genders, and his older daughters, and female servants, if he could afford them. Richer families also had eunuchs to protect their women. In Turkish culture, talking or writing about harems is considered a sin. This lack of written sources, especially from non-foreign writers, makes studying harems difficult and contributes to the fantasies told about them by not providing a factual rebuttal. However, the few sources we do have paint a vivid look into the harems of the Ottoman Empire, especially the most powerful and grand of them all, the Imperial Harem of the Ottoman Sultans, which was one of the most secret societies in the world. What was the Imperial Harem? Also called the Seraglio and the abode of felicity thanks to the Sultan's special relationship with God, the Imperial Harem was the residence of the Sultan's children, female family members, his women, and their servants. The Turkish tribes practiced polygamy before they took Constantinople. The Byzantines, who had ruled Constantinople before the Ottomans conquered it, being Christian, did not have harems, but women lived separately in apartments called the Genesia in the palace. Sultan Mehmed, who conquered Constantinople, adopted the practice of sequestering the royalty, keeping household slaves, and establishing a palace school from the Byzantines. The Genesia merged with the practice of polygamy, and the imperial harem was born. This ended the practice of sultans marrying for politics and replaced it with reproduction through harem women. Mehmed built a new palace in Constantinople, but the harem was kept in the old Byzantine palace until it moved to Topkapi Palace in 1541, where it remained until 1909. The harem and the old palace remained populated, as when a sultan died, his harem women were deprived of their privileges and sent there to live out the rest of their days, unless they remarried. It was known as the Old Palace, the Palace of the Unwanted Ones, and the Palace of Tears. The harem contained almost 400 rooms, centered around the courtyard of the Valide Sultan. Most of the rooms were apartments and dormitories, and the luxury of the living quarters depended on the status of the person living inside them. High-ranking women had their own private apartments, while novice odalisques and eunuchs lived in dormitories. It was a very claustrophobic space, relatively small for the hundreds of women who lived in it who had very limited access to the outside world. The views of Istanbul from the harem's few latticed windows were prized. It was a very comfy place, and the women inside were sheltered from the hardness of starvation, dehydration, poverty, disease, and violence of the outside world. But it was also a very limiting place, with very few freedoms and ways to entertain yourself. It is impossible to know if the women inside it were happy or not. The entry to the harem was called the carriage house, which was open from dawn to dusk. It was guarded from the inside by eunuchs and the outside by halberdiers and royal guards. The only men who were allowed to enter were the sultan, his sons, and eunuchs. Any other man would be beheaded for so much as looking at one of the sultan's harem women, let alone entering the harem. Any woman who had permission was permitted inside, however. Why was there an imperial harem? The sultan was a godlike entity. You could not speak, sit, or look him in the eyes without permission, and you had to walk backwards to leave his presence. He was above society, and for this reason could not marry, as that would tie him to society, both through the relationship to the bride and through the relationship to her family. Having foreign concubines with no family or connections instead of wives removed those ties, keeping him unattached from society. Imperial harems also had superior reproductive abilities, as many children could be made in it, making up for the high death rate of both children and mothers through labor at this time. Who was in the imperial harem? There were two groups in the imperial harem: women and eunuchs. Almost all of them were slaves, who had ended up on the slave market after they'd been sold by their families, captured by slave traders, taken as prisoners of war, or been tributes paid by fathers or local rulers. Bought from the main emporiums in Alexandria and Cairo, young girls and castrated boys were brought to the harem directly by the chief black eunuch or as gifts for the sultan by his governors and foreign dignitaries. The most in-demand girls were from the Caucasus region, who were prized for their white skin, dark hair, and delicate bone structure. All of the girls were thought to be virgins when they were taken to the harem. Whether each individual girl was or not, of course, is impossible to know. The enslavement of Muslim women was forbidden, so almost all harem women were Christian. Slave girls were used in the imperial harem for two main reasons. As slaves, they had less rights to their children than a free Muslim mother would have, and they had no political ties to their family. Arriving at the harem. Being bought and brought to the harem did not mean you would be accepted inside. Once a girl arrived, she'd immediately be inspected for any imperfections by a eunuch. If she was found to be pregnant, disabled, or have any other defects like missing teeth, or had any signs of disease, she would be resold. If she was found acceptable, she'd be presented to the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. If the Valide approved of her, she'd be accepted into the harem. If not, she'd be resold. Once the girl was officially a harem member, she would be immediately converted to Islam, and her Christian name would be replaced with a Persian one that matched some attribute of hers. For example, a girl with rosy cheeks named Cecilia would be renamed Gulbar, which means rosy cheeks. Her clothes would be changed, and the first place she'd be taken was the baths, where she'd clean and be taught how to wash before prayers. From now on, she'd be an odalisque, which means woman of the room, at the bottom of the harem hierarchy. The harem hierarchy. The harem was an institution, and like all institutions, its members had roles, and certain roles were above others. At the bottom of the harem were the odalisques. These were the novices of the harem, who were still training to fit their roles. If they succeeded in the harem, there were two paths waiting for them: the management and reproductive paths. If the Valide approved of them, they would become a gadik. These were the sultan's personal attendants. They could also become a concubine, a woman the sultan slept with rarely. If they become close with the sultan, they could be promoted to an iqbal, a favorite. If an iqbal bore a child, she became a khaden, giving her a status akin to the sultan's wife. If they had born a son, he could become the next sultan, making all khadens the next potential Valide Sultan. The Valide Sultan was the mother of the reigning sultan and was in charge of the harem. Becoming the next Valide was the ultimate goal of any girl on the reproductive path. If an odalisque was not deemed suitable for the sultan by the Valide, but still had skills, she could continue on being a maid. When she had worked long enough, she would become a kalfa, a head maid, and given servants to instruct of her own. In charge of the management side of the harem was the Heznar Usta, the head treasurer, and the Kaya, the head housekeeper. The head treasurer was in charge of the finances of the harem, while the head housekeeper was in charge of managing the kalfas and odalisques. It was the kalfa's goal to reach one of these positions. Sultanas were the princesses, either the sisters or daughters of the sultan. Both sultanas and khadens were above the Heznar Usta and the Kaya, but the khadens were below the sultanas. Odalisques. Now that a girl was in the harem, she was an odalisque. She would spend the next few years of her life at the harem school, where in strict daily lessons she would be taught reading and writing, the Ottoman, Persian, and Arabic language, sewing, embroidery, poetry, crafts, the playing of musical instruments, dancing, singing, religious training, the etiquette of the court, rhetoric and elegant walking, how to be respectful, well-behaved, and never be angry. They could also learn foreign languages if they so desired, and any crafts they made, such as embroidery, would be sold by agents on the market, making those skills profitable. If the odalisque never showed any talent during her education, or if she manifested undesirable qualities, it was likely that she'd be resold on the slave market. An odalisque would sleep in a room with multiple other odalisques, with an old woman watching over them to make sure they weren't breaking any rules by doing things like gossiping or sharing beds. While they were being educated, odalisques would be assigned to either a kalfa or a high-ranking official, such as the Valide Sultan, a khaden, a sultana, or a chief eunuch, depending on their abilities. They acted as servants in these assignments, and commonly formed bonds with the kalfa they'd been assigned to. After they had graduated from school, Odalisques would be auditioned by the valide, showing off the skills they had mastered, such as dancing, singing, or the playing of a musical instrument. If the valide was impressed with her beauty and abilities, she would make her a gadik, or present her to the Sultan as a concubine. If the valide did not deem an Odalisque suitable, she would stay as a servant, continuing to be an Odalisque until she was promoted to a Kalfa, or be freed in order to be married off to a court official. Trained Odalisques were desirable wives, as they were beautiful, talented, well educated in courtly charms, and had important connections within the harem hierarchy. Kalfas. Kalfas were the senior maids of the harem. These positions were held in high esteem, and were occupied by women who had advanced through all parts of the harem's training, but had never had a chance to be with the Sultan. Each Kalfa was in charge of the harem department, which her role would be named after. These roles included Mistress of the Robes, Keeper of the Baths, Mistress of Sherbets, Mistress of Dressmaking, and Mistress of the Coffee. The Kalfa would be in charge of supplying the entire harem with her department's product. For example, the Mistress of Coffee was in charge of making sure everyone in the harem received their coffee quickly and well made. Bigger departments sometimes required more than one Kalfa to run. To assist them in the departments, Kalfas were assigned Odalisques. Usually, a Kalfa would have 6 Odalisques serving her, but she may be granted more if they were required. Some retired Kalfas became Casadars, who lived in a building alongside the harem and stored the saved allowances of girls inside the harem in boxes. Most girls would use their saved money to buy state or treasury bonds. Other retired Kalfas would buy themselves a house, marry, or serve in another household. If a Kalfa excelled at her job, she may have the luck of being promoted to Hasnar Usta or Kaya. Hasnar Usta. The Hasnar Usta was the head treasurer of the harem. All women in the harem, from the sultanas to the lowest odalisques, were given a monetary allowance and amount of material possessions in proportion to their rank. Each woman had full control over her own finances. The Hasnar Usta was in charge of controlling the finances and distributing allowances in the harem, and was commonly consulted for monetary advice by harem women. She was commonly assisted by a second and third Hasnar in her duties. The Hasnar was also responsible for recording each time a woman spent a night with the Sultan. These nights were called couching, and they were recorded in order to establish birth and legitimacy of children. A schedule was kept of what nights the Sultan would spend with his cadens and iqbals, to prevent disputes amongst them. A dossier was kept on each woman who entered the harem, where a menstrual cycle and any night she spent with the Sultan would be recorded. Kaya. The Kaya was the head housekeeper of the harem. She was in charge of overseeing the Kalfas and the education of Odalisques, and distributed resources to departments as she saw fit. Concubines. Concubines were the women the Sultan slept with rarely, possibly only once. While becoming a concubine was a major stepping stone in climbing the harem hierarchy, it was common for women to never advance past it. They were given one servant but not their own room, and they did not rank much higher than trained Odalisques. The mass majority of women in the harem never slept with the Sultan, and never became a concubine. Gadikli. The Gadikli were the Sultan's personal attendants, usually 12 in number. They were responsible for bathing and dressing the Sultan, doing his laundry, and serving his food and his coffee. It was not uncommon for the Sultan to sleep with them, and if they pleased him in bed, he commonly promoted them to iqbals. If he was pleased with their service but did not desire to sleep with them, he'd marry them to a court official. Being chosen. If you wanted to see the Sultan, your best bet would be to win the favor of his mother. The valide scouted women based on beauty, health, as her primary job was reproduction, and shrewdness, because of the important roles mother played in the raising their sons. There were 2 main ways an odalisque the valide approved of would be presented to the Sultan. One was being sent to a semi-covered pool under his apartment, where the Sultan would watch them read, talk amongst themselves, and play games, before choosing any he wanted to see. Another way to be chosen was through dancing for the Sultan. The valide would organize dances for his son, picking the odalisque she saw fit. They were commonly done in groups of 12, dressed in muslin blouses, velvet vests, and skirts that opened like fans. If any of them caught the Sultan's eye, he might choose to lie with her that night, and valides often arranged dances to inspire him to lie with harem women if he had not been doing it regularly on his own. It is rumored that the Sultan would throw a handkerchief at the woman he desired, but that is most likely untrue. It was possible that Odalisque caught the Sultan's attention in other ways, whether just by being spotted by him in the harem or through a strategy on her own part, but we'll never know how these encounters might have occurred, if they did at all. Sleeping with the Sultan. Once an odalisque was chosen, she had to be prepared. First she went to the baths and had face and body treatments. Her hands and hair were painted with henna, and all of her body hair was removed. Henna was placed 4 fingers above the pubic area as a finishing touch. Older women and those who'd slept with the Sultan before came in to congratulate the chosen, dressing her in new clothes and shoes and decking her in jewels. It was likely that the high-ranking women of the harem delivered the final touches and told the chosen about the Sultan and his tastes. Music was played as she was taken to the Sultan's room, led by the chief black eunuch. When they arrived, the eunuch told the Sultan and had her enter when the Sultan commanded it. She went to him and kneeled at his feet, and he received her and held however much conversation he wanted before lying with her. Throughout the entire time she was with him, music was played. Iqbals. When a concubine, Gadikli, or Odalisque gained the favor of the Sultan, they were promoted to the rank of an Iqbal, marking her as one of his favorites. Upon the announcement of her promotion, she'd be bathed ceremoniously and moved into a private apartment, where she'd be given a barge, carriage, and slaves of her own. Iqbals who'd been unable to conceive or delivered stillbirths were sometimes married off. An Iqbal's goal was simple: become pregnant and give birth to a living child, preferably a boy, in order to become a Khaden. Births. Becoming pregnant was a big deal in the harem, giving birth even more so. One of the largest kiosks in the harem would be used for birth. In preparation for a birth, the kiosk would be cleaned and decorated with red bed covers and quilts and gold or silver washing bowls, ewers, and other utensils. During birth, the mother would be accompanied by the odalisque who'd been assigned to her, and was sometimes kept entertained by singers, dancers, and the palace dwarf, who was a male eunuch. She would give birth sitting down, which was considered the natural way to deliver babies. Special birthing chairs were used for this, with a hole cut on the bottom for the baby to slide through and be caught by the midwife. If something were to go wrong, the best doctor in Topkapi Palace would be brought in. However, because he would be a man, he was not allowed to look at the mother, and could only give instructions from behind a curtain based on the information that was given to him. Births were treated as celebrations more than ordeals. After a baby was born, the imperial wet nurse would take over. Also known as a sultan or a milk mother, the imperial wet nurse was one of the most respected members of the harem, and many sultans had close relations with her, such as Selim II, who regularly played chess with his former wet nurse. The chief black eunuch would spread the news to the rest of the palace. Each department would sacrifice 5 rams for a boy and 3 for a girl, and would repeat the sacrifice 5 times over the next 24 hours for each prayer. The valide and grand vizier would arrange audiences to present the baby, mother, and other women of power in the harem with fine gifts, such as cradles inlaid with gems and silk quilts. Town criers would spread the news through the city, poets would write about the event, and the birth celebrations went on for a week. Khadens. Once a woman gave birth to a child, she'd be promoted to the rank of a Khaden, no matter her previous rank, unless the Sultan already had more than 8 Khadens, in which case she became or remained an Iqbal. Khadens were the equivalent of the Sultan's wives, and were ranked. Their rank was usually in proportion to the birth order and sex of their child. The first Khaden was called the Bash Khaden, the second the Isni Khaden, and so on. The first Khaden was the highest ranking, and there were usually 4. The Sultan decided the order of his Khadens, and was the one who promoted or demoted them. The most common way for Khadens to move up a rank was upon the death of a higher-ranking Khaden, after the promotion was approved by the Sultan and delivered by the chief black eunuch. In some periods, the Sultan's favorite Khaden would be given the title Hasaki Sultan. Relationships amongst the Khadens were very formal. When a Khaden wanted to talk to another Khaden, they'd send a Kalfa to convey the invitation. Any lower-ranking woman was expected to kiss the skirts of the Khadens out of respect, and Khadens would often ask them not to as a courtesy. Princes would always kiss the hands of their father's Khadens. The first Khaden received an allowance 2 to 3 times larger than any other women's in the harems besides the valide, making it a desirable role. However, the end goal of any Khaden with a son was not to become the first Khaden, though it was a useful status to achieve. Their main goal was to become the next valide sultan. Princes. A Khaden's main role was to raise and protect her son and have him become the next sultan. The sultan was expected to only have 1 son by each woman, as mothers played important roles in their sons' lives as advisors. Therefore, having 2 sons by 1 woman meant her loyalty, support, and advice would be split between them, giving them a disadvantage compared to the sons who had the full allegiance of their mothers. Princes would be raised in the harem, where they'd be educated in a school in the harem that was specifically used for the education of princes after they turned 5. They'd be taught by a teacher, called a hoka, who'd been appointed by the sultan. The hoka came to the harem daily, and was carefully guarded by eunuchs to make sure he never went near any woman. The chief black eunuch's apartment was located under the school, and he was in charge of overseeing the prince's education. After they'd been educated, the princes would be sent to govern provinces when they came of age in order to gain political connections and experience. Mothers would accompany their sons to their provinces. By Ottoman inheritance laws, all the sons of the Sultan had an equal right to the throne, no matter their place in the birth order. Sons were constantly fighting to become the next Sultan, engaging in a battle of the fittest. When a Sultan died, princes raced to Constantinople and raised support. Whoever got to Constantinople first was crowned Sultan, and the first act of the new Sultan was to put all of his brothers to death. This was done to prevent civil war. This was another reason for why harem women were Christian slaves. The mother of princes had no powerful families to give their sons unfair advantages and to object to their deaths. The Sultan could subtly show which son was his favorite by placing him in the province closer to Constantinople than his brothers, giving him an advantage in the race to arrive and be crowned. Because of this practice of fratricide, Akedin was always in fear for her son's life and put almost all of her energy into making sure he had the support of his father in the military and making sure he was a better heir than all of his brothers. After the succession of a sultan resulted in the death of 19 sons, some of them babies, the outrage from the public inspired a reform to the system. But in many ways, the solution was worse for the princes of the Ottoman Empire. The Cafes. The reform made the act of fratricide illegal and stopped the practice of sending princes to provinces. Instead, princes would be kept in rooms that adjoined the harem, that were kept separate and off limits from it by the Jinn's Kapi, which translates to Genie's Gate. The mothers of princes called their sons my lion, and so the rooms the princes were kept in were named after the cages lions were kept in. The Cafes, aka the Golden Cage. Princes would be moved to the Cafes as young as 8, and would remain there until they died of old age or became sultan. Their education was still overseen by the chief black eunuch, but now they were excluded from public life and activities. The princes had access to tutors and were permitted concubines, though the concubines had had their ovaries and uterus removed to ensure the prince fathered no children by them. If any of these women became pregnant through some oversight, they'd be drowned immediately. The harem population rose because of this, as princes used to keep their harems at their provinces. The doors to the cafes were guarded at all hours of the day by men who'd had their eardrums perforated and their tongues removed. These men acted as guards, but also as potential assassins. A prince was never safe in the cafes. By completely removing the princes from politics in the cafes, they no longer gained the experience they used to in the provinces. This, along with the heavy mental toll living in the cafes took, the ruling abilities of the princes were severely impaired. Some sultans, like Ibrahim I, indulged in violence to make up for the years they lost to the cave. Others, like Suleiman II, mastered skills in the caves and missed the isolation after they became sultan, as he lacked social skills. Suleiman, after being released from the caves after 36 years within it fearing assassination, said, "If my death has been commanded, say so. Since my childhood, I have suffered 40 years of imprisonment. It is better to die once than every day. What terror we endure for a single breath." Sultanas. The sultanas were the princesses of the Ottoman Empire, either the daughters or sisters of the sultan. They were allowed more freedom than other members of the harem, as they had more freedom of movement, though they could never leave the palace without a guard of eunuchs to accompany them. They grew up in the harem, playing with royal children and child odalisques and being formally educated in the palace school until they reached puberty, where they were well educated in music, art, literature, languages, and the Quran. When they were children, they often played with slave girls like dolls, bathing them, braiding their hair, making clothes for them with the help of their mothers, and teaching them things only a princess would know. These slave girls often became the servants of the princesses as adults, and accompanied them to their new palaces when they were married. The main role of a sultana was to be married off to a man of the sultan's choosing, mainly for political reasons. The grand vizier would serve the decree, and as soon as the groom received it, he had to divorce all his current wives. The harem in the household of a married sultana was strictly her personal quarters, with the only other women inside it being her servants. There were no other favorites or wives inside it. An imperial husband's rank depended on his wife's happiness. If he did not remain monogamous, he faced dire consequences, even death. The marriage of sultanas were grand celebrations. The sultans spent lavishly on their daughters' weddings. Feasts, dancing, music, and fireworks often lasted for weeks as drummers, jugglers, acrobats, wrestlers, and cockfights entertained civilians in all parts of the city. As a wedding gift, the sultan would gift the newlyweds with a furnished palace named after them, where they would move after the ceremony. Up until the 19th century, sultanas were commonly married to statesmen much older than them, and were commonly left widowed. They'd then remarry. After marriage, sultanas engaged in politics by receiving the wives of ambassadors and foreign dignitaries in her palace, and visited them in their home countries in turn. Sultanas also received their fathers, brothers, cousins, and nephews in their homes. Balade Sultan. As the Prophet Muhammad said, heaven is under the feet of your mothers. Mothers played a very large role in the lives of princes, and his respect for her was immense, cementing her as a leader of his harem. A man could have many wives and lovers, after all, but he only had one mother. Therefore, he entrusted her with his most private and personal possessions, his women. The Valide Sultan had complete power over the harem. She was the boss of the Hasnar Usta and the Kaya, giving her control over the management of the harem. Every Khaden was subservient to her. Nobody was allowed to enter or leave the harem without her permission, and the eunuchs of the harem answered to her before the chief black eunuch. The Valide Sultan was an important governmental position, and she had a set salary, higher than anyone else's in the harem. She was expected to guide and teach her son on the intricacies of state politics. Often, when the mufti, head of the Muslim religion, or the viziers, the ministers, felt that the sultan had made a wrong decision, they asked her to intervene. Valides rose and fell with their sons. When the sultan died, the valide moved out of the harem to the old palace to make way for the new valide. Often, when a valide died while her son was still on the throne, her death would be mourned by the subjects more than the sultan's own, as it brought no anxiety over the issue of succession. Eunuchs. The eunuch corps were in charge of guarding the harem women. At some points, they were as many as 800 strong. They were all castrated slaves, first supplied by the Byzantines before the Ottomans established their own trade, who were bought on the slave market and taken to the Seraglio. Most of them came from the upper reaches of the Nile, and were sold from Alexandria and Cairo, and were given as gifts to the Sultan. Because castration was forbidden in Islam, Egyptians, Christians, and Jews castrated young boys at pit stops on the journey up from Africa. Egypt's climate did not make for an easy recovery, and newly castrated boys would be buried up to their necks, as sand was considered a balm. Prepubescent boys made up most of the victims, as they had a higher survival rate, and developed less feelings of revenge, loss, frustration, and despair, as they were not as aware of what they'd lost. Castration left these boys with a lack of body hair, a falsetto voice, flabbiness, and obesity, and often left them with weak bladders, short memory, insomnia, and poor eyesight. Boys who survived were luxury items who brought massive profits to their enslavers. Since they were bought by the wealthy, their futures held opportunities for position and power. The eunuchs were potentially the most corrupt element of palace society, as they were the only ones who knew harem secrets and had access to the outside world. Their role as intermediaries let them control the flow of money, information, and power between the harem and the outside world. In Topkapi Palace, there were two types of eunuchs, the white eunuchs and the black eunuchs. The white eunuchs served in the court, away from the harem, while the black eunuchs served in the harem. This was because most eunuchs came from Africa, and because it ensured that if one of the eunuchs ended up having a failed castration and had an affair with a harem woman, the skin color of their child would ensure that they would not be able to be passed off as the sultan's child. New eunuchs were carefully scrutinized before admission to the Seraglio, and regularly once they were inside, to make sure the castration had been successful and to make sure nothing grew back. Unattractive eunuchs were preferred. After arriving, they were assigned to crowded dormitories, and an older eunuch to apprentice under. The discipline of their training for the corps was comparable to that of a military school, and the small amount of free time they had was spent playing with other eunuch boys and Odalisque girls. At the end of their training, some of them would be assigned to the service of a prince, Khaden, sultana, or the valide. One of the jobs of the eunuchs was to ensure women didn't sleep with anyone other than the sultan. This included men, women, and whatever else became available, including objects. It is rumored that cucumbers were not allowed in harems for this reason. Sometimes, eunuchs themselves would betray this rule, and there are many accounts of eunuchs having relationships with harem women. Some of these relationships were legitimate, however, as it was not uncommon for the sultan to marry high-ranking eunuchs to odalisques. Once married, the eunuch and their wife would live outside the Seraglio. Chief Black Eunuch. The chief black eunuch, called the Kislar Agassi, was the head of the eunuch corps and a pasha, aka a lord. He was the highest ranked officer in the empire after the sultan and the grand vizier, and had great political power as the most important link between the sultan and his mother. He could contact the sultan at any time, and was the private messenger between the sultan and the grand vizier. It was said that he was the most bribed man in the empire. He provided necessary odalisques for the harem, oversaw the promotion of women and other eunuchs, acted as a witness at the sultan's marriage and birth ceremonies, arranged all the royal ceremonial events, such as circumcision parties, weddings, and festivals, and delivered sentences to harem women accused of crimes. If they were found guilty, he would put them in a sack and tie the neck tightly before taking them to the executioner, who would throw them off a rowboat into the Bosphorus to drown. If any emergency happened at night, he was the only one permitted to enter the harem. Entertainment. Harem women were enclosed and had a lot of spare time on their hands. To escape boredom, they found ways to entertain themselves. During the summer, they'd entertain themselves in pools. Some sultans would play games with them, such as throwing pearls and rubies into the water for them to fetch. Male actors and mimes sometimes performed for the harem women blindfolded, or from the other side of a veil. Harem women were also entertained by shadow puppet plays. There's evidence that a small amount of harem women also practiced dark magic to try and see the future, ease the present, and remove inner demons. Games. To entertain themselves, the harem women would play games. One of these games was called Istanbul Gentleman, where a woman would dress up as a man by thickening her eyebrows, painting on a mustache, wearing a hollowed watermelon or pumpkin as a hat, and an inside-out fur coat. She would then sit backwards on a donkey, clutching onto its tail with one hand and a prayer bead made of onion or garlic cloves with another. Somebody would then kick the donkey, and she would try to stay on. Another game was a form of tag. A woman would fall into a pool, pretending to have slipped. The other woman would try to keep her in the pool by pushing her when she tried to get out. When she succeeded in escaping, she'd chase the other women, trying to push them into the pool to start it all over again. Another game was Beauty or Ugly. In it, a girl would be blindfolded and ask Beauty or Ugly. She'd pick one, and everyone would strike a pose. She'd pick her favorite poser after taking off her blindfold, who would take her place. These games are childish, which fits the fact that the average age of women in the harem was 17. Inebriation. Opium was the main pain relief method at the time, but it was also used to get high. Many harem women used opium to ease their senses, both as a way to pass the time and as a way to ease their pain at losing their old lives. Opium can cause amnesia, and those who did not want to forget their past would have other women tell them their own stories. Tobacco was also smoked in secret, and alcohol would be smuggled in, though alcohol was forbidden in Islam, especially for women. Animals. The sultans gave their favorites animals as pets, including monkeys, storks, exotic birds, and gazelles. Private rooms had parrots and macaws. The Seraglio had a menagerie, called the Elephant House, and children and women would go there to see the exotic animals kept inside. Riddles, stories, and poetry. Women were not allowed outdoors after sunset and before sunrise, so that was when stories were most likely told. Older women would tell stories to the younger, ending them with 3 apples have fallen from the sky. One belongs to the storyteller, the second to the listeners, and the third to me. Me meaning the protagonist. They also told riddles, which often ended with a threat if they were not solved. The seclusion and the boredom of the harem led many women to poetry. The most common themes were tragedy, suffering, denial, and unrequited love. 11 of the 34 sultans were distinguished poets, possibly influenced by their mothers. A poem from an anonymous harem woman goes, "Fate, in the land of love, separates us now. Mighty mountains between us, greetings from far away now." Gardens. When the Sultan ordered it, the gardens were closed off for harem women. Inside, favorites played childlike games, picked flowers and fruit, ate kebabs and halva, looked at coveys of nightingales, canaries, and doves, and walked in the garden, followed by an entourage of odalisques and eunuchs. Some harem women also gardened. Symbols were ascribed to certain flowers, a practice that eventually spread to Europe. Shopping. Occasionally, high-ranking harem women went to the bazaar, hidden in lattice carriages which they did not exit from. Merchants would display fabrics, scarves, ribbons, and slippers, which the harem women would view from their windows and instruct the eunuchs to buy on their behalf. More often, peddlers brought their wares to the Seraglio in large quantities, which would be then taken to the women inside the harem by the eunuchs. Purchased fabrics would be sent to the palace tailor or dressmaker, who had records of all the harem women's measurements. Female merchants, usually Jewish women, were allowed inside the harem, bringing both goods and gossip with them. These women were called bundle women. Christian male merchants often married Jewish women to corner the harem market, or so they could become intermediaries for affairs and palace intrigues. Sultanas were allowed to go to the bazaar as often as they wished, though they normally did not feel this to be appropriate, instead having merchants show them their merchandise in more private locations such as mosques. Kalfas were allowed to go to the bazaars freely as well. Excursions. Excursions were not always allowed in the harem, but after some Valides loosened social structures, women started going on occasional excursions for picnics and kayak trips, closely guarded by eunuchs. At some picnics, they were entertained by acrobats, puppet shows, dancing bears, gypsy fortune-tellers, or Bulgarian shepherds playing on their pipes. The kaya made the announcement for the outing on the day of, and women rushed to get ready in excitement. They all wore the same color and left in carriages with drawn curtains, bringing pitchers filled with sherbets, bags containing handkerchiefs, tip money, alms for beggars, and hand mirrors for adjusting their veils with them. In the entourage, the high-ranking harem women's carriages occupied the front and the back, while the odalisques rode in the middle. When they returned, they told stories to those who had been left behind. Food. The harem's faculties were separate from the rest of the palace, but it did not have its own kitchen, save for the one in the infirmary and the ones used to make tea and small treats. Proper meals were made in the palace kitchens by men. They'd place the meals on trays, which would be brought to the entrance hallway of the harem by men called tablaquiers. They would place the trays on tables, and when they left, a eunuch would notify the kalfa in charge, who would direct the servants to come out and bring the trays to their intended recipients. If it was for the valide, sultanas, cadens, princes, or iqbals, it would be taken straight to them. If it was for the kalfas or odalisques, it would be delivered and girls would come to it. Women ate with their hands until the reign of Mahmud, as it was believed taste was transmitted through fingertips. Eating with the hands was an art form odalisques were trained to perform with delicacy, lightness, and grace. The right hand was used for food, using only 3 fingers. After a meal, servants delivered a silver pitcher and basin for washing the hands and an embroidered towel for drying them. Harem breakfasts were modest, though lunch and dinner were big meals. There was a mid-evening snack of fruits and sweet desserts, followed by coffee. Coffee was never drinking with breakfast. Baths. Turkish baths were adapted from Byzantine baths, which themselves came from the Roman baths. They were supplied water by Roman aqueducts. The Sultan, valide, sultanas, and cadens all had their own private baths, while the rest of the women used a communal bath, called a hammam. While in the hammam, women were required to wear wooden shoes called clogs. There, they would bathe for hours at a time, making it a time-consuming pastime. Because it was a common superstition that water was filled with evil beings, there were no tubs, so women would pour water on themselves to wash. Sometimes, they'd use water filled with perfume. They'd be helped by servants, who'd supply them with bathing robes, towels, perfumes, and baskets of fruit and pastry, and often by other women, who'd help wash them, rub spices on their body thanks to the belief that spices increase seduction abilities, and put henna on their hair, hands, and feet. Close relationships were formed in the baths, including romantic ones. When arguments arose, the culprits would be seized by the bath attendants and pushed out into the courtyard to calm down. Having body hair was considered a sin, so it was common to see women shaving in the hammam. All hair from the waist down would be shaved, as well as nose and ear hair. To do this, burning paste that contained arsenic would be applied to the skin before being scraped off with a mussel shell. If the paste was left on too long, it would eat into the skin. Women used this paste because it cut the hair off at the follicle, making sure it didn't grow back faster and stronger like cutting with a razor does. After bathing, high-ranking women were taken to the resting rooms, where they were massaged, scraped, and pomaceed. They were then taken to adjoining rooms to be rinsed and left to rest on mattresses, given coffee or tea, and tell gossip. After they were done in the adjoining room, they would go to the outer hall, where slaves would dress them in warm clothes and dry their hair, before leaving them to sleep. The infirmary. The harem had its own infirmary, run by a kalfa called the head nurse and the midwives under her command, who handled most medical issues in the harem. It was its own unit and had its own laundry facilities and kitchen, as it was observed the sick did better if a special diet and cleanliness. For fresh air, the infirmary opened around a courtyard. For serious illnesses, a palace doctor would be allowed inside the harem, accompanied by 2 rows of black eunuchs. When a sultana, kaden, or the valide sultan fell ill, she was attended to by the personal doctor of the sultan in her own apartment. Midwives. As the deliverers of babies, palace midwives were essential to the harem. With each child they delivered, the richer and more popular they got, as the mothers of children gave them gold and precious presents. Many palace midwives owned big houses. Midwives also advised on health, serving as some of the main doctors in the harem, as male doctors were not allowed inside except in cases of emergency. They also advised on contraceptives. Unlike Christians, Muslims allowed contraceptives, as they believed nothing could stop the birth of a child that Allah wanted to be born. One of the contraceptives they'd advised the use of was wood tar. Midwives also made tampons, coated with oils, herbs, and honey. The Sultanate of Women. When the harem moved from the old palace to Topkapi Palace with Harem Sultan in 1541, the harem found itself right in the center of power. This, combined with the harem's ability to influence the sultan, resulted in harem women taking power. The century and a half where harem women greatly influenced politics was known as the Sultanate of Women. To gain power, Women would bribe and patron officials with their wealth, communicate with the Grand Vizier and other court officials through the eunuchs and bundle-women, make alliances through the marriages of their daughters, and formed foreign relationships. The caliphs made sons more dependent on their mother's political experience, and a string of child and insane sultans gave the way to the position of regent. While multiple women vied for power in this time, I will be focusing on the three I found the most influential: Harem Sultan, Nurbanu Sultan, and Kosem Sultan. Harem Sultan. Harem Sultan was born either Anastasia or Alexandra Lazovska in the Ukraine as the daughter of a priest. She was captured by Crimean Tatars and sold as a slave. She was bought by Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, as a gift. She was taken to the harem and renamed Harem, the cheerful one. Harem caught Suleiman's attention and soon became his favorite, to the exclusion of all others. This made her a threat to Suleiman's old favorite, First Khaden, and mother of the crown prince, Mahidevran, as any son Harem had would put her son, Mustafa, in danger. A fight broke out between the two women, in which Mahidevran called her soiled meat, a piece of meat off the slave market, pulled her hair, and scratched her face. The fight was broken up, and that night Suleiman called for Harem. She refused the call, saying she was a piece of soiled meat and that her injury made her unbefitting to be in Suleiman's presence. He called her again, and this time she came, telling him what happened, certainly painting her rival in a bad light. This was one of the earliest examples of Harem's intelligence. Harem gave birth to her first son, Mehmet, in 1521, making her third Khaden. By tradition, Suleiman then should have moved on from Harem and started spending time with other women. But Suleiman did not, and ended up having 5 children with Harem, 4 of them sons. This ongoing relationship unsettled people, and some started accusing her of witchcraft, saying she was using magic to make Suleiman fall in love with her. 2 new Russian slaves were brought to the harem to try and divert Suleiman's attention from Harem. Rightly seeing them as a threat, Harem stirred up enough of a fuss for Suleiman to give them away. In 1533 or 1534, something unprecedented happened. Suleiman freed Harem, not to let her go, but because you could not marry your slave. It was a complete break from tradition, as the Sultan had never married a former slave before. As queen, Harem built diplomatic relationships, influenced her husband politically, and occupied new apartments next to her husband's. Suleiman was a campaigning sultan, spending more time at war than in Topkapi Palace, leaving Harem behind as one of the central powers. The couple frequently wrote to each other while Suleiman was away, exchanging love letters and poems. Harem also wrote to him about the happenings of the palace. Now that Harem had gained more power in the harem than thought possible before, she turned her attention to the protection of her sons. Mahidevran had been eliminated as a rival years ago when she was sent away with her son when he was sent to rule a province, but Mustafa was still a threat to her son's safety. He had the support of the army and the Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, the man who'd brought Harem to the palace in the first place. Now he was a threat. Harem wrote to Suleiman, telling him about Ibrahim's arrogance about his own self-worth, as he'd made remarks that put himself above the Sultan. This, combined with Suleiman's suspicion about Ibrahim's finances, assuming he was corrupt, was too much. Suleiman invited him to dinner, and afterwards, while Ibrahim slept, Suleiman had him garroted with a bowstring. This was the royal execution method, used not to spill royal blood, signifying the respect Suleiman had for his former best friend. Ibrahim put up too much of a struggle, however, and his skin was cut as he was strangled. Like Harem, Ibrahim had been a slave, who had moved up in the hierarchy he'd been thrust in. His death was a reminder that it was just as possible to fall as it was to climb. He was replaced by Rustem, the husband of Harem's daughter Mirama, who was almost certainly Harem's ally, 8 years later. Harem had removed one of Mustafa's supporters, but the main threat still remained. Mustafa was tall, strong, handsome, very popular, and Suleiman's favorite son. Unintentionally, Mustafa was a rival to his father through his popularity, and Harem most likely used that to turn Suleiman against his son. Suleiman received a letter that Mustafa was plotting against him while on campaign, and when Mustafa heard the news, he went to his father in Iran to clear his name. There, Suleiman had him garroted by mutes. Her son's position secured, Harem started charity projects. To display her power, she built several large mosques. She also built hospitals and hospices, sometimes in the 3 holy cities mentioned in the Quran, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Harem died of sickness in 1558, in her 50s. In a blessing of sorts, she died before she had to see her sons fight for the throne. Her daughter, Mirama, became Sultan's main advisor after her death. Suleiman died 8 years later, and was succeeded by their son, Selim II. Nurbanu Sultan. Nurbanu Sultan was born Cecilia Benir Bafo in 1537. She was the illegitimate daughter of two noble Venetian families, and was captured by an Ottoman admiral and brought to the harem at the age of 12. She was presented to Selim II when he was young and still a prince, and he fell in love with her. Following in his father's footsteps, Selim married her, and had one son and 4 daughters with her. He stayed loyal to her for a very long time, but had more sons with different women later in life, though she remained his favorite. As the successor of the great Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim was a disappointment, often called Selim the Sot. His death fit his nickname, as he stubbed his toe in the bath, probably while drunk, slipped, and cracked his skull open on the floor. To ensure none of Selim's other sons would arrive in Istanbul before her son, Nurbanu hid Selim's body in an ice cellar. It was only when her son, Murad, arrived that Selim's death was announced. Murad spent some time alone with Nurbanu after arriving. In this time, she most likely reminded him of his duty to kill his brothers, of which he had 5 who were all in the palace. Murad was convinced, though he took no pleasure in the order. The people of Istanbul were shocked to see the coffins of the princes the next day, not because of the fratricide itself, but because it was the first time it had been done under their noses. One of the mothers of the dead princes then killed herself. Nurbanu was Murad's main advisor. She ran her harem like a large corporation. She was the one who installed Khalfa's department heads and gave them odalisques to train. She convinced Murad to take up residence in the harem, giving her greater influence over him. The harem's population grew from 130 in Selim's harem to 600 in Murad's. The Ottoman Empire reached its peak under Murad III. Like his father and grandfather, Murad had a special favorite, Safiye Sultan. She and Nurbanu did not get along. Nurbanu spent a lot of time trying to divert Murad's attention from Safiye, arranging many nights for him to watch beautiful odalisques dance. When his sisters gifted him 2 concubines, Murad finally gave in and started sleeping with other women, practically pushing Safiye aside. Successfully. It is theorized that he had 112 children, and upon his death he had 27 daughters and 20 sons. Safiye still had power, however, and remained a thorn in Nurbanu's side as she competed with her in picking out new concubines for Murad. Nurbanu had 20 rooms in her apartment. Like Harem, she built mosques and spent money on other charitable pursuits. She also funded the military, a statement of power on an international level. She also formed foreign relationships, the most notable being the alliance with France she made with Catherine de' Medici. She died at the age of 58, at the height of her power. She was buried in the same tomb as Selim. Murad attended her funeral, which was notable, as sultans did not attend funerals in order to keep themselves unattached from society. Murad died 12 years later. He was succeeded by Ahmed I, whose first act as sultan was to have his 19 brothers killed. The outrage from this act led to the invention of the kafes. Kosem Sultan. Kosem was most likely born Anastasia in Titos, Greece. She was 15 when she became the favorite of Ahmed I. She had many children with Ahmed, who died after a 15-year reign. His brother Mustafa was crowned sultan after being released from the kafes, and Kosem's sons took his place. Kosem was then transferred to the old palace. Mustafa was soon dethroned by the eunuchs and sent back to the kafes. His son, Osman, preceded him, though he did not rule long before he was killed by the Janissaries and Sifas in the first act of regicide in the Ottoman Empire. After Osman's death, Mustafa was crowned again, and would have had Kosem's son executed if he was not stopped once again by the eunuchs. Then, finally, Kosem's oldest son, Murad IV, was crowned sultan in 1623. Kosem returned to Topkapi Palace as Falade Sultan. Seeing as Murad was a minor, she also declared herself regent, making her one of the few women to rule Muslim Empire officially. For most of Murad IV's reign, Kosem effectively ruled the empire. She attended court meetings from behind a curtain during her time as regent, and continued to do so even after Murad became of age. Murad was cruel, and her youngest son, Ibrahim, was insane. Kosem's favorite son was Bayezid, whom Murad executed after he threw Murad off in a joust. On his deathbed, a sonless Murad told his mother he would prefer for the dynasty to end with him than to go to Ibrahim, who he left alive because of his insanity. He ordered Ibrahim's death, which Kosem prevented. After Murad died, Ibrahim was ordered out of the kafes. He refused to leave, thinking Murad was playing a cruel trick on him. He only stepped out of the kafes when he was shown Murad's corpse. Once crowned sultan, Ibrahim's insanity made itself very clear. He had his harem women kneel naked and galloped amongst them like a horse. He ordered that the fattest woman in Istanbul be brought to him, and when she was, she told him a story about a man who decked his house in furs. Ibrahim then developed a fur obsession himself, imposing a fur tax to make it easier to get them. He had his sisters serve the odalisques. Once, he had all 300 women in his harem drowned in the Bosphorus in a particularly bad fit of madness. Kosem hit the peak of her power under Ibrahim's reign. She ruled the state with the Grand Vizier, who she appointed. She was most likely the main person responsible for keeping the empire alive under Ibrahim's insanity. Eventually, the viziers grew tired and wanted to dispose of Ibrahim, which Kosem agreed with. Ibrahim was thrown back into the caves and was garroted 10 days later. Ibrahim was replaced with his 7-year-old son, Mehmed. Kosem declared herself regent again, but there was a problem. Mehmed's mother, Turhan Sultan, who wanted the power to herself. Tradition mandated that Kosem step down and retire to the old palace. She did not, and a tug-of-war over the young sultan began. Eventually, her conflict with Turhan hit a peak. Kosem plotted to have Mehmed poisoned, in order to replace him with a younger grandson whose mother was dead. The plot was discovered and failed, but that did not discourage Kosem. She had the support of the Janissaries, and plotted to have them enter the harem and kill Turhan and Mehmed. The eunuchs, however, supported Turhan, and strangled Kosem after finding her hiding in a closet. Kosem's supporters in court were massacred soon after. Turhan Sultan became Balade Sultan, and like the woman before her, built mosques and other philanthropic works. She was not a skilled politician, however, and the Sultanate of Women came to an end with her death.